Listen to part of a talk in a history class. The gold mining towns and the characters.
Does anyone know what happened in 1848 that caused the West to become populated very quickly? No? Oh, there are lots of interesting stories that are told about the gold mining towns and the characters who lived in them. Have any of you heard of James Marshall? Not the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. This is James Marshall. Still no ideas? Okay, let me tell you about James Marshall's discovery. James Marshall was a worker living in the California area. He was there to build a water-powered sawmill on property owned by John Sutter. Okay, now I see some of you who think you might know. Well, Marshall found some bits of gold in a mill race on Sutter's property. Those little flakes of gold that he found in Sutter's stream near Sacramento caused an uproar all over the country, and even as far as Europe. He discovered the gold in 1848, and the two men, Marshall and Sutter, tried to keep the discovery a secret. But you know how secrets are hard to keep. Well, so as soon as the news of gold being found at Sutter's Creek got out, people began pouring into California in droves. And the gold rush had begun. People living in California rushed to Sutter's mill, and by 1849, people from all over the country began heading for California.
Did they all go by wagon train, like a lot of the other settlers?
Yes, that was one of the ways. But they also went by ship, and that took a long time too.
I think I remember reading that ships had to go around the tip of South America to reach California. Of course, that was before the Panama Canal was built.
You're right, but they also traveled to Veracruz, which was a busy port in Mexico. And then they got off the ship, traveled overland, and headed northwest up to California. And some really brave souls sailed to the Isthmus of Panama, left the ship and headed to California from there.
Well, once all these gold seekers got to California, what was it like?
These gold seekers were called prospectors and 49ers, because news had not gotten back east until 1849, and most people began their trip west in 1849 as well. These 49ers descended upon California by the tens of thousands. Nothing like this had ever happened before in our history. Towns sprang up everywhere overnight. Tents, saloons, wagons, dirt streets, gunfights and street fighting. Tall tales of gold in the hills, all part of the gold rush towns.
Did a lot of people become really wealthy?
Some did, of course, but most did not. And within about 5 years, most of the gold was gone. Oh, there are lots of interesting stories that are told about the gold mining towns and the characters who lived in them. One fellow, who didn't get rich by finding gold, made lots of money fixing wagons. I'm sure you have all heard about Studebaker automobiles. Well, a young man named John Studebaker had gone west to seek his fortune. But when he got there, he saw all the wagons that were broken down and needing repair. The wagons were those which people had come west in, and the wagons and wheelbarrows that the 49ers were using to mine gold. Well, Johnny Studebaker had come back from east, and his family had been in the wagon business. They had made some of the Conestoga wagons people used coming west, and he knew all about how they were made. He also knew how to fix them. He started fixing wagons and became known as Wheelbarrow Johnny, and he earned a lot of money because he had a skill that others didn't. And with all of his earnings, he moved back to where his family was starting a new wagon factory in South Bend, Indiana, and he invested his much-needed money into the new company, which later developed into the famous Studebaker Automobile Company. So, when you ask if people got rich, the answer is yes, they did, but not all of them got rich mining for gold.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer.
Number 12. What is the talk mainly about? Number 13. Why does the professor mention James Marshall? Number 14. What does the professor say about the people who went to California? Number 15. According to the professor, of what significance was John Studebaker? Number 16. What does the professor say about the people who traveled to California by ship?
Listen again to part of the talk, then answer the question.
Does anyone know what happened in 1848 that caused the West to become populated very quickly? No? Oh, there are lots of interesting stories that are told about the gold mining towns and the characters who lived in them.
Number 17. Why does the professor say this?
Oh, there are lots of interesting stories.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. Ferns.
Today, we are going to talk about an ancient family of plants, ferns. Ferns are leafy plants which predate flowering plants. In fact, they were growing about 200 million years before flowering plants came into existence. There have also been some early fern fossils which have been found, and these are thought to be from the Mesozoic age, and that era was more than 300 million years ago. So, we are talking about a very old plant family. Ferns are vascular plants, and by vascular I mean plants which conduct water through specialized tissues. As a result, these plants grow to larger sizes. Now, there are spore-bearing and seed-bearing vascular plants, and ferns belong to the spore-bearing group. The flowering plants and conifers we have talked about earlier, they are seed-bearing vascular plants. So, we know that ferns are vascular plants, and that they reproduce through spores, and that they have specialized tissues which conduct water and food. I'm going to expect you to learn the terms associated with ferns, and your text has a complete list of vocabulary words associated with the fern. You will need to be familiar with all of those terms, but today I want you to understand just a few of those terms. The frond is the leaf of a fern, the stipe is the stem of the frond, and the blade is the main part of the frond. So, the stipe and the blade make up the frond, and the spores, I talked about them a minute ago. Well, they are found on the underneath side of the frond and go inside casings. Now, what kind of climate do ferns like? Well, ferns are delicate plants and they need moisture. Sometimes they can grow in dry climates, but if they do, they usually don't reproduce very well. So, what they like is the cool canopy of a forest. The treetops and forest growth provide a protective covering for the ferns, and this shelter is the type of environment that ferns love. They also like moist areas along creeks and streams. In order to survive, ferns need moisture in the air and in the soil, so that it is another reason they like the cool climate and the environment of a canopied forest. As you know, there are many types of ferns, and the different factors they need to survive will vary according to their type. But regardless of how much of each factor they need, each fern will need nutrients in the soil and enough light for photosynthesis, but not too much sunlight. They also need suitable temperatures. They can't live in freezing climates or windy climates for that matter. Now, over the years, ferns have adapted to their environments, and some can live in hot climates, but all of the factors I just talked about combine to determine how healthy and how long ferns can live in climates which aren't moist. During the Victorian era, and that time period was from 1837 to 1901, the period of Queen Victoria's reign in England. Anyway, during the Victorian era, the fern became a very popular indoor plant. It was frilly, added warmth and coziness to homes, and during this time period, houses were beginning to have larger windows and bay windows, so plants could get lots of sunlight. And window areas were more humid than other parts of the house too. And another big reason ferns became popular indoor plants was that the people who loved nature thought plants like ferns would bring nature indoors. So, you have ancient plants which have evolved over the centuries to adapt to environments, both interior and exterior. They are one type of a vascular plant. They need moisture, both in the air and in the soil, and they need nutrients in the soil. We will be spending time in the next lecture talking about spores and reproductions of ferns. So, what you need to do between this class and next is to learn the terms set out in your chapter on vascular plants, Read the assigned materials and come to class prepared to ask questions that you have.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer.
Number 18. What does the professor tell you about ferns? Number 19. What does the professor say about the frond? Number 20. What is an environment most ferns like best?
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
I am going to expect you to learn the terms associated with ferns, and your text has a complete list of vocabulary words associated with the fern. You will need to be familiar with all of those terms.
Number 21. What does the professor imply when he says this?
Your text has a complete list of vocabulary words associated with the fern.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
We will be spending time in the next lecture talking about spores and reproductions of ferns. So what you need to do between this class and next is to learn the terms set out in your chapter on vascular plants. Read the assigned materials and come to class prepared to ask questions that you have.
Number 22. Why does the professor say this?
We will be spending time in the next lecture talking about spores and reproductions of ferns.
Number 23. How does the professor introduce the next lesson?